Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening in Indonesia, Jakarta time. Now is 16:40. I introduce a bit on these to recall the theme of Global Solution Summit 2022. It aims to be the stepping stone to the G20 and G7, and also T20 and T7. And for this session, it is entitled Blending Public and Private Funds to Close the SDG Finance Gap. This is part of the effort of local economic transformation. And as you know, as the COVID pandemic has unleashed unprecedented crisis, the Sustainable Development Goal progress is likely to be slowed down or even reversed. The massive monetary and fiscal, as well as real sector stimulus package, backed by piling up external debt, are introduced worldwide to help the lives and also to protect the livelihoods, limiting countries' ability to advance the SDG progress, especially on poverty, healthcare, and education. And I think for this session, we have three objectives. The first is to explain and expose the current financing required to meet the 2030 agenda. And the second is to propose ideas for SDGs financing amid COVID-19 pandemic on the related initiative and coordination between T7 and T20 for SDG financing. And last is to discuss how to scale up blended financing of public and private funds in closing the finance gap. And we have here the outstanding prominent speakers. The first will be Professor Bambang Brodjonegoro. He is the lead co-chair of Task Force 9 T20 Indonesia Global Cooperation for SDGs Financing. He is a professor at the University of Indonesia, and he was the Minister of Research and Technology, also Minister of National Development Planning of Indonesia. Also, he was the Minister of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia. And second will be Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He is the Director for Center of Sustainable Development, Columbia University, and also T20 Indonesia Advisory Board. And it will be followed by the panelists, Professor Thye, and then Professor John McArthur and Professor Lynn Wagner. I think I'll make it short, and I would like Professor Jeffrey Sachs to speak about 7 minutes for you. Professor Bambang first, and then Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and then followed by panelists. I think Professor Bambang, time is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Edhie Purnawan. Very good morning, good afternoon, and also good evening for all speakers and participants of this Task Force 9 of T20 Indonesia Global Cooperation on SDGs Financing. First of all, as the lead co-chair, I would like to thank Global Solution Initiative to be the host of this TF9 conference. And we hope that the link between the institution and also between T7 and T20 will be even stronger. So let me greet first Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director of Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, and also T20 Indonesia Advisory Board, Professor Thye, Research Professor at Sunway University, Malaysia, as well as co-chair of Task Force 9 of our T20. And then Professor John McArthur, Director of Center for Sustainable Development, Brookings Institute, co-chair of T7 Task Force, International Cooperation for the Global Common Good. Professor Lynn Wagner, Senior Director at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, as well as co-chair of Task Force 9 T20 Indonesia. And of course, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to Global Solution Summit Task Force 9 working session, blending public and private funds to close SDGs financing gap. The COVID-19 pandemic has significantly hampered development agenda around the world, despite facing the same health, social, and to an extent, economic crisis The global recovery process from COVID-19 have been fragmented, with less developing countries lag behind in the recovery process, risking an increase in global economic inequality. In this case, countries around the world need to coordinate and scale up financing efforts to accelerate recovery and ensure the achievement of the SDGs 2030. The public sector limited fiscal capacity during the pandemic, compounded by the various expenditures needed to address the health and economic crisis in the short term, has forced the government to reform its financing strategy to keep its long-term development plans on track. One strategy that can be applied to fill the development financing gap is through a blended financing scheme. The scheme aims to mobilize private capital flows to projects that contribute to sustainable development while still providing financial returns to investors. In this case, decision makers need to develop an unworkable SDGs financing ecosystem, both for private sector and government. Steps that can be taken to support this effort include strengthening financial institutions to support SDGs financing, creating multilateral platforms and multi-stakeholder partnerships, strengthening the role of MDBs, multilateral development banks, in supporting SDGs financing for developing countries, intensifying efforts to increase philanthropic contribution, and developing SDGs debt swaps and various other innovative financing instruments. Multiple action can be taken to close the funding gap for the SDGs, including increasing ODA, official development assistance, and private funding, expanding blended finance, and enhancing collaboration between G7 and G20 countries. We must also consider moving beyond GDP and traditional economic growth as means of addressing the problem with a focus on inclusivity, sustainability, and resiliency. These issues will be further discussed in this forum, including on how SDGs financing on mitigating carbon emission in developing countries will not only addressing the issue of climate change, but also work to tackling poverty and inequality and adopt it on a path aligned with the capacity of the country. Therefore, the discourse on financing and good practices that have been proven to strengthen financial institutions for financing development needs to be supported. The meetings of G20 leaders and policy experts in this forum is the right moment to express this support. The Global Solution Summit is the world premier forum for transforming research-based insights into policy recommendation for the G7 G20. This forum embodies the spirit of collaboration among countries to address various development challenges in the world, especially recovering from the pandemic. I hope we can continue to collaborate to achieve SDGs as we are looking for a better place to live. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. That's the keynote speech from Professor Bambang Brodjonegoro. I think the most important thing is the multilateral and also multi-stakeholder collaboration and also commitment for this blended financing. And the second, the speech from Professor Jeffrey Sachs for 7 minutes. Time is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me be brief and to the point. The Sustainable Development Agenda is to a very significant extent an investment agenda. The poor half of the world, the low-income countries and the lower middle-income countries, which I'll focus on, constitute almost 50% exactly of the world population in 82 countries. These countries are characterized by capital scarcity, low levels of 3 kinds of capital. Human capital, meaning that schooling and health are much lower per person than in the high income and upper middle income countries. Second, infrastructure capital, electrification being perhaps most notable, digital connectivity and other infrastructure. And third, private business capital, equipment and machinery, factories, and so forth for productive activities. when one makes standard kinds of calculations of the capital stock per person in the high income countries and the low income countries, the ratio is roughly 50-1. So countries are poor overwhelmingly because their productive assets per capita are low. The job of finance is to help finance capital deepening, a rise of capital per person, taking into account that we're in need of many different dimensions of capital deepening. As I mentioned, human capital, probably first and foremost, infrastructure capital, business capital, and of course, protection of natural capital. So I view this challenge, whether it's the 17 SDGs or the Paris Agreement, as an investment challenge and an investment framework. At SDSN, we feature 6 major investment platforms: education, health, energy transformation, sustainable land use, urban infrastructure, and digital connectivity. But the point again is an investment framework. Now, the drama of the world is that the international financial system does not produce financing at scale for the poorer half of the world. Just to give you a couple of numbers, the low-income countries have 8% of the world's population, but only 0.4% of the world's investment per year. The lower middle-income countries have 42% of the world's population, but only 10% of the world's investment. The high-income countries have 15% of the world's population and 53% of the world's annual investment. So the international financial system directs flows to the high-income countries rather than to the low-income countries. This is reflected and partly caused by the credit ratings. There are 27 low-income countries. Not a single low-income country has an investment-grade credit rating. There are 55 lower middle-income countries, only 3 of which have an investment grade. In summary, 79 of the 82 countries in the poorer half of the world are without an investment grade. That means if they borrow, they pay high interest rates and short-term maturities for funding a long-term investment program. And the result of that is a high propensity to a so-called credit event or a suspension of payments or default risk, because funding a long-term investment program with short-term high-cost capital is prone to disaster. And so we have a situation in which the poor countries cannot get the finance they need. The finance they get is a small amount of what's needed, and it's of very unstable stop-go variety. We need to address this. The finance ministers of the G20 need first to understand this, that the system that they govern, in effect, is broken. It is not even remotely delivering sustainable development for at least half the world. It is delivering low-cost capital for the richest countries in the world, but high-cost short-term capital for the poorer countries in the world. So what to do about this? To my mind, the first thing is analysis. We need a different framework. We need to understand the current system is broken. We need countries to present and to work with the international community, especially with the Bretton Woods institutions, in my view, on a long-term investment framework. Even the IMF and the World Bank do not have a long-term investment view. They don't have a growth framework. They don't have a 30-year perspective. They don't even design one. Article 4s and country programs are short-term. So we don't have anywhere a development investment framework as a formal part of our global governance. For that reason, everything looks risky. And as long as things look risky, they will be risky because they will be treated as risky. Whereas if we had a long-term investment framework that explains how a low-income country is going to develop on the basis of sustained finance, it would not look so risky. Moreover, one can't finance long-term investment, say a generation of children in school, on a 3-year loan or a 5-year loan. This must be financed on a 30 to 40-year maturity. This requires a different architecture once again. And based on an investment framework, one could get long-term lending as the basic standard of what is needed for the public investments, especially the human capital and the infrastructure investments. The amount of new investment needed in the low income and lower middle income countries is probably between $1 and $2 trillion per year flow. And that is on a base of about $27 trillion of annual global saving. So we're talking about a shift roughly of 5 to 10% of global saving towards the bottom half of the world. This is completely achievable, but it will not occur within our current institutions. Our goal should be long-term, low-cost financing in the framework of sustainable investment planning and implementation. And there are many steps to reach that goal. Higher domestic tax collections in poor countries, development of domestic credit markets in poor countries, reform of the private capital market credit rating system, which is completely broken, reform of the debt sustainability framework of the World Bank and IMF, which is essentially a short-term framework, not a long-term development framework, and some other steps, refinancing existing official debts for long-term, low-interest finance. But the most important thing we need to do is to bring the attention of the G20 finance ministers that this system is broken. It will not deliver the Paris Agreement. It will not deliver the SDGs. We can't have a situation in which the low-income countries are investing only 0.4% of world's investment. So let me put those basic thoughts on the table, and back to you, moderator.
Okay, thanks very much, Professor Jeffrey. I think it's very interesting because about the failure of the system. The framework is not working well, and we need some effort to transform the framework and also the ecosystem to be more balanced. Okay, thank you very much. And now we are moving to the panelists. There are 3 panelists here. The first is Professor Thye, and he is the research professor at Thye University, Malaysia. Also, he is the co-chair of Task Force 9, T20 Indonesia, the global cooperation for SDGs. And he's going to talk about the approach to increase SDGs financing in developing countries and also how to raise ODA with a series of measures that of the donors to increase their ODA contribution. Professor Wu, the time is yours.
Thank you, Pak Edhie, for identifying these important questions. Before COVID-19 hit 2 years ago, the United Nations had estimated that the annual SDG financing gap is about 2.5 trillion US dollars each year. To have a sense of the magnitude of the challenge of raising $2.5 trillion in additional financing, I would like to recognize two background facts. The first background fact is that the total ODA of the 30 members of the Development Assistance Council is only $152 billion, which is only 6% of the financing gap. The second background fact about the challenge of financing this gap is that we do not live in a generous world. Back in 1970, the UN had recommended that ODA be 0.7% of the GDP of the rich countries. But yet, we see that the actual amount of 154 billion in 2019 compared to the target of 352 billion. In other words, the world hardly met half of its obligation. So the great hope of blended finance is that the ODA could be leveraged such that it would attract in large amounts of private funds through ingenious procedures like the ODA serving as the first loss tranche or used to guarantee the principal of the private loans. Well, this crowding in of private finance is very important because, like Jeff pointed out, most of the countries do not issue bonds that are recognized as investment grade by the international rating agencies. Two questions come naturally to mind. The first question is, what is the size of the multiplier factor that is created by blended finance? Would one additional dollar in ODA attract 3 additional private dollars, or would it attract only 1 additional private dollars? That's the first question. The second question is, what would be the best way to raise this additional ODA that is needed? What I would like to suggest is that we think seriously about a 1973 proposal by James Tobin that we should tax transactions in the foreign exchange market. The foreign exchange market is an exceedingly large one. The gross financial flows in 2019 is 1,716 trillion US dollars. So let me now give you some numbers to get a sense of the implications of James Tobin's suggestion. Let us say that the multiplication factor of blended finance is 3. If that is true, then the additional ODA that is needed is $587 billion, which is more double the target that we get from the present ODA program. To raise this $587 billion, the tax rate only needs to be 0.03%. And if the multiplication factor is only 1, then the tax rate that is needed is only 0.07%, which is very small, which is way smaller than the 0.5% that was proposed by James Tobin. In other words, we are talking about a number that's 0.03 or 0.07 instead of 0.5. The first question that comes to mind is, why should the rich countries agree to the imposition of this Tobin tax? The answer is, it is good for you. If you look at the crisis of the end of the 20th century, we first had the Asian financial crisis in 97-98, which was mostly caused by speculative capital flows. And then we have the global financial crisis in 2008 that came from the housing bubble, the subprime bubble. So taxing the global financial, global currency markets will be adequate because it is 30 times larger than the amount of the value of trade on global stock markets. The second thing is it credible to believe that the world could agree to such a suggestion? I would say yes. I think we should be very optimistic about it because, after all, the world had recently agreed to impose a minimum corporate tax to prevent us from running into the trap of the race to the bottom. I think given the importance of fighting climate change and of reducing global geostrategic tensions, this raising of funds in ODA in order to use in blended finance to leverage up the amount of private funds is something that we should consider, largely because the tax rate we are talking about is exceedingly low, 0.03% tax rate. But Edhie, I would stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Wu. I think the financing funds are large among the countries, especially the large and the poor countries. I think that's part of your presentation. And the next presenters will be Professor John McArthur. He is the Director, Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institute, and is also the co-chair of T7 Task Force, the International Cooperation for the Global Common Goods, and he is also a Senior Fellow, Global Economy and Development. Professor McArthur, the time is yours.
Thank you so much, and really a pleasure to be with you. And I don't know how much I have to add on the big picture after Jeff and Wing. Jeff having taught me much of what I know about global development finance, and Wing having been a mentor for so long. But anticipating this conversation, I thought I might flag a couple of very particular points. I think Jeff's assessment, hard to outdo the coherence in terms of the numbers, the scale, and the range of issues that need to be addressed here on a system that is fundamentally broken in tackling them internationally. I would just add on the sectoral assessments. I do think that something like the T20 can play a major role in breaking the glass on the over-bundling of the assessments across the different SDG sectors. Jeff outlined the 6 thematic areas that SDSN is pursuing. There are different ways to slice that problem, but the fundamental issue is that the large-scale numbers are in infrastructure, without question. That's the infrastructure financing gap, which also is the core of the climate sustainability financing gap. The agriculture and food is a separate major piece that intersects, of course, closely. But then I want to focus a little bit on some of the social sectors. We have in the education domain globally, arguably the single biggest financing gap is for secondary education globally. The sum of global ODA of public investments for education at the secondary level is the grand total of approximately $2 billion a year. In global terms, this should be understood as a zero relative to the scale of investment that's required for tackling the global secondary education need. With that said, I want to focus on what I consider the first among equals of the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's target 1.1 on ending extreme poverty by 2030. And reflecting on this conversation, it's actually 17 years since Jeff put out this book you might have heard of called The End of Poverty, which at the time was a very bold thought. And I remember Jeff and I debating at the time, he thought it could be done by 2025, and I did a little bit of math and I said, well, maybe it should be 2030. And that was the range of the discussion back then. But then very importantly, 8 years later, a pretty important institution called the World Bank actually set its headline target of ending extreme poverty by 2030. So I recently went back to look at how's it going for the countries with the most extreme poverty. And what I have seen in the country level documents of the countries with the largest concentration of extreme poverty and the largest trajectory of extreme poverty, and what I've been hearing informally from colleagues at the World Bank, is that extreme poverty is absolutely not the number one organizational priority of the enterprise. So it is not consistent, not with the Sustainable Development Goals, but with its own goal. And this is a fundamental gap in the global system that 9 years after that commitment was made needs to be understood by the G20 leaders as a governance problem. I think would be a euphemism, but it's a fundamental gap that needs to be taken on with a sense of purpose and focus. Now, on latest trajectory, depending on what numbers one believes, there's been certainly a blip, if not a fill-up in the counts of extreme poverty due to the pandemic. Much of the global aggregates are due to a jump in India over a couple of years. There's a little bit of statistical artifact built into that, likely based on how close the distributions are to the line. But the underlying fundamentals for where we're on track by 2030 have also jumped by around 100 million people. And that's really concentrated in 5 countries that account for almost half the number. The latest estimate is that Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Madagascar, and Tanzania amount for 43% of the extreme poverty we're likely to see in 2030 unless we do things better. That's out of probably 550 to 600 million people who will still be in extreme poverty at that time unless we do better. There are some countries like Chad, South Sudan, Central African Republic, and Somalia that are, of course, making pretty much no progress on these challenges, if not worsening. And I list these countries because I think this is the degree of specificity we have to have, and the numbers suggest we need to have if we want to get to extreme poverty elimination to fulfill existing commitments by 2030. I would also stress that these numbers require a certain degree of clarity of thinking about how we might solve the problem. And this might be an area, maybe just for fun, but also it's a deeper point where I think Jeff and I might even disagree. There's very little we disagree on analytically, but here's one point. There's a G20 commitment that came out last year in the Italian G20 to provide a floor of social protection for all. A floor. In the Addis Ababa commitments in 2015 that are meant to govern the financing for sustainable development system, there's a commitment to a floor and minimum basic services for all. These commitments together form, in my view, a commitment to a floor for social protection, at least on the income or consumption support side. The UN and the ILO are working on issues of an accelerator for jobs and social protection. But I would argue that the World Bank needs to be the central focus point for debate and practicality on how extreme poverty can be eliminated by 2030. At its bottom line, we've seen through the pandemic, countries like Togo use the blend of public resources, public sector responsibilities, and private sector technologies to do hyper-targeted, rapid targeted cash transfers. In my view, in a world, especially where the governance systems might be having trouble reaching those most left behind, it is incumbent on the international system to make sure that they are finding a way to use technologies like mobile telephony-based digital cash transfers to reach the furthest behind first. This is now, thanks to experiments like Togo and more recently in Democratic Republic of Congo, a practicality. And the argument that I would make is that the World Bank, in order to take its own commitments seriously, its own headline commitment, should be developing ideas for this as the policy of last resort. There can be a debate over whether it should be an agriculture-led strategy, whether it should be an infrastructure-led strategy, whether it should be a health-led strategy. All of those are reasonable debates in any individual country. But at core, we now have the technology and we have a financing gap that is so small, it's less than 100 billion globally. And it's of that, about 1/4 is in countries that can afford it themselves, and probably 3/4 is in countries that need help, about 25 billion and 75 billion. We can literally think about buying our way out of the problem as an international community to solve that headline first among equal sustainable development goals by 2030. And I would urge the T20, the G20, and all the relevant governing bodies to take seriously that proposition in order to fulfill that first among equals promises of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor McArthur. Then we have to, reverse the focus on what is faced by the poor nation, especially the attention for the extreme poverty that you mentioned before, which is at all, it is not number one organization, the objective of the institution, development institution. Thank you. The last panelist will be Professor Wagner. May I introduce Professor Wagner? Professor Wagner, he is the Senior Director, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, and she is the co-chair for Task Force 9, T20 Indonesia, the global cooperation for SDG financing. And she's going to talk about the move beyond the GDP, the role of inclusive wealth to finance SDGs, as well as the requirement of the transition towards beyond the SDGs. I think the 2 points will be discussed for the last panelists. Time is yours, Professor Wagner.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And building on what Jeff Sachs said about needing a long-term investment framework, we need tools that help us to measure where we are on that long-term trajectory. And as the UN Secretary General said in our common agenda just last year, GDP is failing to account for human well-being, planetary sustainability, and non-market services. So it's time to collectively commit to complementary measures. And so I'm here to tell you about inclusive wealth, which is a complementary measure to GDP that would measure the sum of human, natural, social, produced, and financial capital. So five measures. So the countries can determine the sustainability of their development. As Cambridge professor Dasgupta said in his Economics of Biodiversity report, in order to judge the path of economic development, nations choose to follow they need to adopt a system of economic accounts that records an inclusive measure of their wealth. Others have, including the OECD and World Economic Forum, agree that decision makers must focus on building their nation's wealth if they're to ensure sustainability. And so simply counting GDP growth to improve well-being is no longer enough, if it ever was. This is a real blind spot in measuring and thinking about financing the SDGs. So that the 2030 Agenda provides a framework and means of implementation to achieve the UN's SDGs by 2030. And Dasgupta sees inclusive wealth measures as a critical guiding metric and prioritization tool to SDG implementation, as they assist with balancing efforts to improve human and produced capital without the depreciation of natural capital when selecting investments and policies to achieve the SDGs. So wealth measurement highlights deficiencies related to poverty, SDG 1 that we just heard about, healthy lives and well-being, SDG 3, and transition towards a green energy, SDG 7. But current approaches to wealth measurement show how produced capital is not necessarily inclusive, as promoted by SDG 8, nor does it necessarily align with sustainable consumption and production patterns identified in SDG 12. So if we can add inclusive wealth to decision makers' toolboxes, it'll help them to reframe public policies and investments. And once they do that, they'll be better able to balance short-term growth imperatives with long-term environmental, social, and economic well-being. This is critical as achieving the SDGs and implementing the Paris Agreement on climate change is going to require large financial investments to strengthen all kinds of capital. By tracking broad measures of wealth, these investment decisions can properly account for the impacts of associated emissions and environmental degradation. But so how do we do this? First, decision makers need to be informed of the importance of moving beyond GDP and of choosing inclusive wealth as an alternative. Not many countries are doing this so far, although New Zealand has committed to regular measurement of inclusive wealth, and Canada is considering doing it as part of its proposed quality of life framework. But so once we can tell them that they learn about this, the next step would be to begin measuring inclusive wealth. And this is a really complex task that needs to involve national statistical offices. They are going to require additional resources to carry it out, as measuring inclusive wealth is a significant statistical undertaking. First efforts can include measuring inclusive wealth, could focus on produced capital, financial capital, and commercial natural resources. Human capital would be the next most important to measure, and complex aspects such as natural capital, like ecosystems, and social capital might be addressed last. So finally, then, once decision makers are engaged and statistical offices have begun producing the data, inclusive wealth measures must be used to shape new, more sustainable development policies. And this will be an iterative process, as decision-making processes don't change overnight. But as we are able to tell success stories and document them, they'll be able to inform subsequent rounds of decision-making. And these success stories can show the way to achieve our objectives.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Wagner. I think the inclusivity, and must be beyond the GDP. It relates to the how to increase the wealth. I think is very important for to make the world more balanced. Okay, I think the time is 17:16 in Jakarta time now. We have still 4 minutes. Then, sorry, there are many questions. Maybe I'll choose one only for 4 minutes remaining time. And I'll choose a question from Cornelius Kruger. Cornelius Kruger, I think, is the according to my search, is a postgraduate student in economics and also the professional in something related to SDGs. And the question is, there is a high interest by private investor to achieve positive social impact, as can be witnessed by billions of funds labeled as ESG. Yet many of these funds have been rightfully accused of greenwashing. Question is, how can this fund be channeled to effectively and credibly finance the SDGs? I think you have each 1 minute to answer the question, started from Professor Bambang Brojo. Silakan, Pak.
Okay, my first reaction would be simple. Yesterday, I became one of the panelists in a session in the Global Solution Summit, and one of my co-speakers, Pier Carlo Paduan, who's former finance minister of Italy, mentioned something that I fully agree. We have been talking about ESG so much, but the emphasis on E, which is environmental, has been too much, and we don't give enough attention to the S and G. So to answer Cornelius' question, at least as a basic answer, I would say, why don't we try to give more attention to social and the governance aspect? So the idea of greenwashing will be reduced because then we have other emphasis on the ESG to be implemented. I think that will be my first reaction. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Bambang. And then Prof. Sachs.
I think a point that I would add is that there is a difference of the question of ESG investing and financing of poorer countries. These are two different issues, and they involve different questions. The ESG involves the allocation of funds to dirty versus green investment, for example, within the United States, within Europe, or within a developing country. The flow of funding from the capital markets to the poor countries is a separate issue, much more related to the observation that these countries are not given credit-worthy ratings. And therefore, no matter how much the ESG investment funds stand on the stage and announce their commitments, they are not allocating funding to holding the assets of the poorer countries. So I just want to distinguish these two issues, and both need attention, both need some elaboration. Let me just use 10 seconds more to agree with what John McArthur said that I think is crucial, which is that if the main institutions are not oriented around this task, that is, in addition to everything else, a profound governance crisis. And I review daily IMF agreements with poor countries. Those agreements are so divorced from what is needed for achieving sustainable development that it is somewhat shocking. But it doesn't even alert the board of the fund or the staff that they are proposing programs that have no coherence with the Sustainable Development Agenda. The DRC, for example, Democratic Republic of Congo, is in a program where the health budget approved and in the IMF program context is about $3 per person per year. But nobody noticed. In all of the reviews and the discussions, no one noticed that this is absolutely incompatible with everything that we're trying to accomplish. So there were no alerts and no solutions offered. So I think what John McArthur said is extremely important for us, which is that we need institutional coherence. Especially, we need to be directing finance to the goals that we have set. And we're not going to do that until the institutions that are normatively at the center of the multilateral system are taking that on as their central responsibility. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jeffrey. That is Professor Wu.
I think that what that has been said about ESG funds not flowing to the poorest countries of the world is the fundamental issue. I think it is important that ESG funds set a target that 15% of the investments should be in the poorest 80 countries of the world. I think we need more direct targeting of where the funds ought to go, rather than just to say for environmental purposes, because then it could well be to the environmental problems of the richer countries.
Thank you. Professor McArthur, 1 minute.
I'll just say very quickly, I agree with, we're kind of a chorus of agreement on all these issues on this panel, but and Lynn Wagner as well. I really like the comments on the broadening, but I would just say on the ESG, I would stress we're in a risk, I think, right now of multiple equilibrium. ESG has gotten such a bad name in many corners of the markets because it's so diffuse, and especially in the public markets, it's often closer to meaningless. When the core of the concepts is exactly about doing the right type of investment, avoiding the wrong type of problems. The central issue there is we don't have a way to measure it yet. It's another issue where there is a European conversation, a North American conversation, and I would argue an Asia-based conversation. And the G20 could be a crucial platform for adding coherence to what counts as good private investment.
Okay. The last one is Lynn.
Yeah, and just following on the ideas of the need for institutional coherence, that going back to what I was saying, that having measuring these the objectives in terms of these long-term inclusive wealth rather than short-term measures will help us have more institutional coherence in what we're trying to do, and that would trickle down to this.
Okay, thank you very much, professors. I think times is already 17:24. We have to stop now. I would like to make a summary. In order to meet the 2030 agenda, we have to explore and raise financing requirement, collaboration between nations, institutions around the globe. Professor Sachs tell us that it has to have a coherent institution, coherent countries, something like that. And about the scaling up, blended finance for public and private funds for closing the finance gap, we need maybe at least, as you mentioned before, 5 points. The first is about the pooling donors funds and standardizing investment, and also to to fix the broken system, and also revising the incentive models, and especially when they treat in developing the human capital, infrastructure capital, business capital, and protection natural capital. Also, we can generate the data points to be made available and accessible more globally, especially for the financing itself, and making private sector investment in the funds eligible for official development assistance. And maybe one more is enhancing the global investable project and building up the capacity among all actors and stakeholders. And some of the points that you mentioned is very important, and we already write all of the your suggestion, and we will follow up of your suggestion. I have to stop now, and I thank you. Assalamualaikum.